I thought the worst moment of my life was the morning I watched my ex-wife slide my termination papers across a glass table, smiling like a stranger, while my billionaire boss, her fiancé, looked past me as if I'd never existed. I was wrong. The worst arrived 3 months later when I was 50, delivering pizza to a Back Bay apartment, and an old man peered at my face and said, quiet and certain, "You're Thomas Grant's son, aren't you? You're watching Revenge Files. Subscribe for a new twist daily." My name is Michael Grant, age 50, Boston, Massachusetts. Until the winter of last year, I was a vice president of leasing at Northbridge Meridian Properties, the kind of company that buys dead factories and resurrects them as glass and steel cathedrals where hedge funds drink cold brew and stare at dashboards. I like the work. The math of foot traffic, the poetry of light in a lobby at 4 p.m., the feel of finished oak under my palm when we walked a client through a space and the city hummed beyond the window grid. I took pride in returning phone calls, in telling landlords the truth even when it hurt, in not promising what a zoning board wouldn't allow. Mornings I ran along the Charles from the BU Bridge to the Museum of Science, breath cutting in the cold. And at night, I made dinner in a one-bedroom on Tremont, cast iron pan, olive oil, a ceramic bowl chipped where my father had once tapped a spoon for me when I was 6. My routines were small, but they felt like a life. Leather portfolio by the door, stainless steel watch with a scratch across the 3, the paperweight my father kept on his desk, a chunk of marble from a demolished bank branch on State Street. I valued craft, truth, and loyalty, which was maybe why I didn't see betrayal coming until it stood up and shook my hand. I believe in the idea that if you kept your side of the street clean, people would too. I drank black coffee, returned carts to the corral, held doors for whoever was behind me without looking. I thought character was a bank account you kept adding to, and that one day, interest would cover you when times went thin. I didn't know how quickly a person could be zeroed out. Well, I didn't know that winter, what would burn through the bottom of every belief I had, was that the account my character lived in wasn't the only account carrying my name. I should have noticed the first micro signs, but we always noticed them too late. The humiliation came with the quiet of carpeted hallways and the hiss of a cappuccino machine that always sounded like it was laughing at you. The email said, "Urgent, 9 a.m., Executive Conference A." At 8:58, I walked past framed aerials of our projects. Fort Point, the seaport, a tower in Providence that looked like an award. The conference room was chilled. The glass table reflected a grid of downlights. Alan Pierce wore a Navy suit that cost more than my car. He had a swimmer's shoulders and that permanent tan that doesn't come from Massachusetts. He checked his Patek, didn't meet my eyes. Lauren sat at the far end with legal, hair pulled into a knot so tight it looked weaponized. 6 months earlier, she and I had signed divorce papers at Suffolk Probate, speaking softly like burglars in our own home. Now she slid papers toward me, and I watched the diamond on her left hand wink like a signal. "Restructuring," Lauren said. "Redundancies. We appreciate your service, Michael." I read, "Termination without cause, a severance that insulted arithmetic, an NDA that gagged a dog." My mouth tasted of copper. "Alan," I said because I needed to say his name like it could bring him back to our shared past of site visits and jokes about HVAC. "You know my pipeline. You know what I built for you." Alan looked through me. "Good luck, Mike," he said. "Truly." On the way out, Lauren handed me a cardboard banker's box with a post-it Grant desk. Inside were the leftovers of a life. A mug from a leasing conference in Phoenix, stapler, lint roller, the marble paperweight, and a scuffed black leather portfolio my father had given me when I landed my first real job, the stitching frayed like a scar. "You can take your old junk," she said without looking up from her phone. Minutes later, as the elevator hummed down past floors that used to rise for me, my phone buzzed. "Enjoy being nobody," Lauren texted. I wanted to reply something vicious and dumb. I didn't. I put the phone face down on the portfolio and watched my reflection buckle in the brushed steel of the elevator door. I thought that was the final flattening. It wasn't because I hadn't opened the portfolio yet. I applied everywhere. Real estate in Boston is as small as a cul-de-sac. The calls that didn't return told me more than the ones that did. 2 weeks after the firing, the recruiter I'd known for 10 years returned my third voicemail and said what nobody had said aloud. Michael, I've been told you're not to be considered. It's above me. He didn't say who told him. I asked anyway. He sighed like a tire losing air. You know who? Rent was $2,250 due on the 1st. Cobra made my mailbox heavier. At 50, my resume looked too expensive for retail and too contaminated for my industry. I took a job delivering pizza for a place on Columbus called Bruno's, whose owner had a voice like a trumpet mute and paid cash on Fridays. The first night, the insulated red bag buckled oddly against my hip. The second, I learned the city by steam and pothole, the specific way headlights smear on wet brick. The third, I sat in my Corolla at a curb in Back Bay and cried loud enough to fog the windshield. Fathers were walking sons home from a Bruins game, and I felt something collapse inside that didn't make a sound. On night 17, February air cutting my knuckles, I carried 2 large margaritas up to an apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, second floor, crown molding, runner rug that made my shoes whisper. The door opened on a man in a charcoal cardigan, late 70s, upright as a lamppost. He stared at my face not like he was looking at me, but at somebody standing just behind me. "You're Thomas Grant's boy," he said. "Aren't you?" Everything in me lifted and braced at once. "I'm Michael," I said. He was my father. The man's hands were square and knuckled like someone who'd signed deals with a fountain pen all his life. "I knew it," he said, half to himself. He glanced past me at the winter night, then stepped back. "Come in. Don't worry. Cash idea still applies." I should have refused. Bruno's wanted quick turns. But the apartment smelled of lemon oil and old paper, and on the table by the bay window lay a thick ledger bound in black, the kind of thing nobody makes anymore. He paid me, and then, as if the pizzas had been a reason to bring me to a place where the real delivery would happen, he asked, "Did Thomas ever tell you what we built?" "No," I said, because my father had been the kind of man who carried his sorrow like a briefcase and set it down only when you weren't looking. The man's eyes shone with something I couldn't name. "I'm Edward Holloway," he said. "Ned, to your father. He and I started a company in 1982, Grant and Holloway Real Estate. He owned half, exactly half." He tapped the ledger. "When he died, his shares didn't vanish. They went where he intended." My mouth went dry. "To my mother?" I asked. His face bent, something like pity. "To you." He turned the ledger and pushed it toward me. A page inside had an embossed seal so crisp I could feel it cutting the paper. He tapped a column of numbers, then took out a tablet from a leather sleeve. The screen reflected in the window like a ghost. He pulled up a valuation spreadsheet and rotated it toward me. "Current value," he said. What I saw made the room tilt. The number was so clean it looked unreal. I rang 3 more doorbells that night by muscle memory alone. Back in my apartment, I pulled the scuffed leather portfolio into the pool of light on my kitchen table. The zipper's pull was an old brass tooth. Inside, under a sheaf of dated leases and a Polaroid of my father pushing me on a tire swing, was a thin envelope with my name on it in my father's careful print. A small brass key was taped to the back. The card inside was bone white, thick as a coin, with a blind embossed crest. Holloway Trust Private Office, 125, High Street, Boston. In the lower left, "For Michael, on your 50th. The back had a number in pencil and a scratched notation. "Call before noon." TG. I dialed. A woman answered with train calm. "Holloway Trust Private Office." "My name is Michael Grant," I said. "I found a card. My father's name is Thomas Grant. He worked with—" "Please hold," she said, and something in her voice, a slight thinning, made my skin tighten. I stood by the window looking at Fenway's lights in the distance and counted the hums in the line. When she came back, she didn't sound surprised, which somehow scared me more. "Mr. Grant, we've been expecting this call. Can you come today? Bring the object." "The object," I said, looking at the portfolio like it might answer. "What is this?" "Bring both," she said. "The portfolio and the key. If possible by 2 o'clock. I looked at the time on my scratched watch, 12:41 p.m., and texted Bruno that a family emergency had flared and I'd make up the hours. At 1:52 p.m., I stood in front of 125 High Street, a building of granite and glass that had learned to be modern without forgetting what it had been. The lobby smelled like wax stone and new paper. The receptionist fit a headset and said, "Mr. Grant," as if she'd memorized my face. A man in a dark suit appeared within seconds. He had the posture of a musician and the eyes of someone trained to gather information without you noticing. "Mr. Grant," he said, "I'm Daniel Farr, Private Client Services." He scanned my driver's license, then used a wand to scan the portfolio for metals like I was smuggling sparks. "We're going to need a thumbprint and a signature. Also, if you'd look into the camera." I looked, a little flash popped. We went through a door that looked like a wall. A corridor slid by, framed black and white photos of buildings that used to be banks, an engraved directory of family names that meant something in Massachusetts. A woman in navy met us by a second door, where a brass plate read archives. She handed me a half page with dates and a line for my signature. "Attest that you are Michael Thomas Grant, born October 4th, 1975, she said. "That you are the son of Thomas Avery Grant, deceased July 11th, 2005. And that you are in possession of the original object." I signed. My handwriting looked like it had drunk too much coffee. Daniel took the tiny brass key from the tape and held it up against a numbered drawer that might have been built when pens used ink. "You'll insert the key," he said, "and turn only when I turn mine." Two keys clicked in a choreography that made the hairs on my arms lift. The drawer slid out heavy, as if full of weather. Inside lay a black moleskine notebook, a manila folder with a red string closure, a microcassette in a plastic case labeled July 2005, and an envelope sealed with wax, the impression of a ring in its surface. Daniel glanced at the items like a doctor glances at instruments before an operation. "Before we proceed," he said, "there's a short notary protocol." We signed a ledger with a fountain pen that bled the good way. I pressed my thumb onto a square of stickum that took my print and held it gleaming. Daniel's voice stayed calm, but the precision inside it felt like a held breath. "This isn't what you think it is." We opened the folder on a table that had probably heard more secrets than most churches. There were documents too clean to be old, copies prepared recently. I realized for me. Daniel slid the first page toward me. "Certificate of Limited Partnership, Commonwealth Harbor Partners, LP. Executed June 7th, 1982, he said, his finger steady under the line that read, "General Partners, Edward P. Holloway, Thomas A. Grant." The next page was dated March 18th, 1998. Amendment to Limited Partnership Agreement. It read, "Memorializing certain capital contributions by Northbridge Capital Partners, LLC, and a conversion of general partner interests to a class of preferred units." My father's and Holloway's signatures rode the bottom like twins. The next document was a schedule of units, stamped as of June 30th, last year. There were two names at the top, Holloway Trust and Grant Family Trust, each holding 50% of the Class A preferred units of Commonwealth Harbor Partners, LP. Beneath was a schedule of assets the partnership owned, parcels and buildings, the bones behind the skin of Northbridge Meridian's portfolio, the land under the buildings, the long leases whose rent escalations were a metronome. The next sheet was a valuation summary prepared by a firm I knew well from transactions, Ridgeway Valuation Group, Cambridge. It showed the net asset value of the partnership's holdings as of January 31st. Daniel slid his finger under the bold number, tracing it as if helping a reader learn. $312,450,000. The room went colder. When I lifted my eyes, the photos on the wall seemed to look back with something like recognition. I swallowed and found my voice somewhere behind my ribs. "My father," I said, because I needed to say his name in this room that had kept it safe. He never told me. Daniel tapped the microcassette. "You did," he said. "Just not yet." I held that number inside like a hot coin, and for a long minute I just listened to the blood in my ears. "Let's hear him," I said, because my father had disliked delays. Daniel set a small player on the table like a relic and pressed play. The hiss of tape unspooled a room, I remembered, the clink of a spoon in a mug, the distant thud of someone upstairs. Then my father's voice, lower than I remembered, full of tiredness and a warmth that made my throat close. "Michael," he said, "if you're hearing this, it means you turned 50, which feels impossible and exactly right. He laughed. The sound cut me open. I was going to wait to tell you in person, but my heart is a drawer with a sticky slide. Ned and I started Grant and Holloway in '82 when interest rates were mean and men wore beige. We did what we could with what we had. When money came in '98, the smart play was to take it and keep the ground. That's what this partnership is, the ground. People think buildings are the asset. Buildings age. The ground doesn't. He took a breath that sounded like a held pain. I made mistakes with your mother. I wasn't easy. When it got ugly, I chose quiet over right. I thought I was protecting you from the fight. Maybe I was protecting myself. Either way, I put my half where men who build pyramids with paper can't reach. I set it to open to you at 50 because I wanted you to be old enough to hold it without it turning you into something that isn't you. There was a long pause where I could hear the radiator tick. A judge once told me winning is mostly surviving, but I learned a better thing after. He loved her more than he loved being right. My father exhaled. I loved you more than I loved being seen as right. If this helps, use it like a tool, not a weapon. If it hurts, forgive me. If it frees you, forgive us both. The tape clicked and stopped. I sat with my hands on my knees. I wanted to find a way to stand up into the man he thought I could be. In the envelope sealed with wax, I found a letter on cream paper with a watermark that shadowed when you tilted it. My father's handwriting slanted left like he was always leaning into weather. He wrote about a parcel in South Boston that had turned into a jewel and about a clause that seemed like a footnote, but wasn't. The partnership had consent rights over any encumbrance on the ground leases. Control without noise, he wrote. It keeps men honest. I tucked the letter back and looked at Daniel. What do I do? First you breathe, he said. Then you sign acknowledgement of receipt. Then we call Mr. Holloway. He wants to be in the room when you speak with Northbridge Meridian. My mind went to Lauren's text and the silence that followed it, and something that had been a fist in my stomach opened. I want the board in that room, I said. I want Alan there. I want legal. I want every chair with a nameplate. Daniel nodded, as if checking boxes he'd already drawn. Tomorrow, he said, 10 o'clock. Their place or here. I didn't want to walk back into their lobby and smell the cappuccino laughing. Here, I said. They can walk into our light. I slept badly, but the kind of bad that feels like a useful ache. At 7:12 a.m., I pressed my only decent shirt with the iron hissing like a whispering crowd. At 9:47, I stood in the lobby at 125 High Street, the marble cool under my soles, the leather portfolio suddenly heavier like it had absorbed history. At 9:58, through the glass of the conference room door, I watched them arrive. Alan first, jaw clenched, moving like a man who has spent his life being let through doors. Lauren with legal, hair looser than the last time, but her eyes trimmed of softness. Two directors I recognized from quarterly meetings, one with a necktie patterned with tiny anchors, the other with a haircut that cost 3 phone calls. Ned Holloway walked in with a cane he didn't use except to keep time with. When he saw me, he nodded, an old band leader counting us in. Nameplates waited at the table with bottled water and a plate of cookies that looked like a joke. On the wall, framed photos of the city from before any of us had decided to change it. Horses on Winter Street, snow piled like fabric. We shook hands as if our palms could erase what the past months had written. Alan's grip was dry and hard, and his face was blank enough to be a kind of weapon. Lauren's knuckles brushed mine for one accidental second, and I felt a memory rise like a fish and fall back. Daniel opened the meeting. Thank you for coming on short notice, he said. Mr. Grant has asked to convene the board of Northbridge Meridian Properties in his capacity as a controlling beneficiary of Commonwealth Harbor Partners, LP. Alan's eyebrows lifted. I'm sorry, what capacity? Ned set a ledger on the table with a soft thump that felt louder than it was. The ground under your towers, he said gently. The leases you pay into. The consent rights you need for certain kinds of debt. We've been quiet for 30 years. Today we aren't. Legal cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. We're going to need to see. You will, I said, and my voice surprised me by sounding like it always had when I walked a client through a term sheet. Calm felt like a rope I could hold. I slid copies across. The certificate of partnership, the amendments, the valuation letter with the copy watermark that didn't photograph well. We'll start with this, I said. Then we'll move to the consent clause. Alan flipped a page, then another. His jaw muscle jumped once, a bird under skin. Where did you get this? He said. It wasn't a question. It was a complaint. My father left it, I said. I did not look at Lauren. Ned tapped the consent clause with a capped pen. Section 7.3, he said. No encumbrance, refinance, or transfer of beneficial interest in ground leases without consent of the class of limited partners, namely us. For 30 years, we gave it. We approved things in good faith. We were never asked to approve the debt you took last fall to buy back stock, Mr. Pierce. Silence is a sound when everyone hears it. Alan's eyes went small. That was corporate debt, he said, not partnership. Secured indirectly by cash flows from the ground leases, Legal said before she could stop herself. She colored, which told me she was better at her job than most. If this clause is valid, she added, the lawyer in her tightening the hinge. It is, Daniel said. It was tested the year I was admitted to the bar. I slid a map onto the table. The seaport, Back Bay, Providence. Colored dots for parcels. A little legend in the corner that could have been a child's drawing. These are the shells, I said, and we own the nuts. I let that sit. Then I leaned back and folded my hands and said the words I'd kept like a stone in my mouth all night. Here's what I want. Alan waited like a man who can buy most things and dislikes being told otherwise. And what do you want? He said, the cadence city smooth and slightly tired. First, I said, you notify your recruiters that any blacklisting of Michael Grant ends at noon today. A letter on letterhead to every firm you whispered to. Second, you issue a retraction to the industry press of the rumor that I was fired for cause. Third, you step down as CEO within 60 days. You can be chair if the board wants. Fourth, you will contribute $10 million to a workforce housing fund for Dorchester, Roxbury, and Chelsea to be matched by the partnership at my discretion. Alan laughed, then stopped when nobody joined him. You're shaking me down with my own company, he said softly. It isn't your company, Ned said. It never was. We'll let you believe it could be. That's on us. But the ground is ours. If we withhold consent on any refinancing, your share price goes through the floor. And the covenants in your latest notes permit acceleration if certain consents are withdrawn or if a material undisclosed counterparty emerges. We are that counterparty. We emerged. Legal stared at the map as if it were an MRI. The director with the anchors on his tie leaned forward. What do you want from the board? He said to me, gentle the way a surgeon can be gentle before they cut. Stability, I said. The projects don't suffer. Tenants don't smell blood. You get to frame a narrative, vision, stewardship, continuity. Pierce exits as a builder who served the city. The rumor mill gets quiet because the millers are tired. I turned to Lauren for the first time. You can keep your job if you want it, I said. HR needs people who know where files live. She flinched like a line had snapped inside. I didn't blacklist you, she said, too quickly to be useful to herself. You forwarded the request, I said. You didn't originate it. I know the difference between a blade and a hand that passes it. Her eyes went glassy for a second and then cleared. She set her jaw as if to hold back speech. Alan lifted his hand like he was in a class. And if we refuse, he said, then we withhold consent on the refinance you're shopping right now for South Station Tower 2. I said, your lenders discover a clause they should have discovered earlier. Your board opens a subcommittee to review the oversight. It becomes the story, not me. The anchor tie director looked at the other director and then at legal and then at Alan the way a man at the bow looks at the shape of a wave he can't outrun. We need an executive session, he said. We'll step out, Daniel said. He stood, and I followed, the leather portfolio under my arm. Ned's came ticking time as we walked to the hall. Through the glass, I could see them talking, each face a collection of calculations. In the corridor, Ned put a hand on my forearm. Your father, he said quietly, would have been proud of how little you raise your voice. I wanted to throw my chair, I said. You waited, he said. Waiting is a tool. They kept us waiting 13 minutes. When the door opened, Alan's face had the gray of old newspaper. The anchor-tied director spoke for them. Mr. Pierce will transition to non-executive chair within 60 days, he said. A public notice will frame it as a long-planned succession. The board will commission a report to clarify consent protocols. The letter regarding Mr. Grant's separation will be drafted today, and the housing fund will be established with a $10 million contribution from Northbridge Meridian to be matched by the partnership at your discretion. He looked at me like a teacher asking if the back row can hear. We'll need the partnership's cooperation on messaging. You'll have it, I said, and you'll have a quiet consent for your refinance once you file an amended disclosure. I'm not here to break the company. I just needed the company to stop breaking me. Alan swallowed. He looked at me for the first real time in months. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded like a man who had learned too late how expensive sorry can be. Lauren didn't speak. She gathered her papers like a person who knows exactly how many things she needs to carry to leave a room in the same shape it was when she entered it. As they filed out, she paused near me. Her perfume tilted me back a year. I didn't know about the ground, she said. He didn't tell me everything. She didn't say who he was, and she didn't need to. I thought he'd be fine. I am, I said, and only as the elevator doors slid shut did I realize it was true enough to hold. After, there was the work of turning a figure on paper into something that didn't corrupt my hands. I sat with Daniel and Ned in calendar pages and talked to people who didn't speak in headlines. I called a nonprofit in Dorchester that runs apprenticeship programs for HVAC and electrical. I met with a dean at Madison Park Technical Vocational High School in Roxbury, whose office smelled of dry markers and hope. We drafted a charter for the Thomas Grant Apprenticeship Fund to pay for tools, certification fees, and transportation stipends so a kid who couldn't afford a bus pass wouldn't have to choose between paying rent and becoming an electrician. We made the housing fund do something more than paint a lobby. We structured a revolving loan pool for small developers building 3 flats on vacant lots in Chelsea and East Boston. Interest capped at 2.5%, with a clause that if profits exceeded 15%, the difference would cycle back into the pool. We put language in the partnership agreement that mattered to me, a line requiring that every project publish an explanation of how it would affect the block beyond its footprint, written in words your grandmother could read. It looked small on paper and enormous in practice. On a Tuesday, I walked past a Hilton in the financial district after a meeting and remembered the feel of its lobby armchairs, the leather cool at 2 p.m., and realized I had begun to measure rooms again, not by how expensive they were, but by how many people felt welcome in them. I took the T to Fields Corner and listened to a foreman explain why night crews needed different coffee than day crews, and I thought about my father saying the ground doesn't age. I understood it now. Money could build scaffolds around you until you forgot the dirt under your shoes. If you remembered the dirt, you didn't trip as much. Lauren texted, once the 3 dots blinking and then stopping, and then a line that looked like she had found the smallest word she could live with. I'm sorry, she wrote. I thought I was choosing safety. I typed and erased a sentence 4 times and then sent. I hope you find it. She didn't reply. Alan's exit went out on Business Wire with a photo of him at a groundbreaking shovel in soil that wasn't his, a quote about stewardship and the future. The story landed quiet. At Holloway Trust, we framed my father's letter in a simple black frame and hung it not in the conference room, but in the small glassed-in library where sunlight sat on the spines of books and people kept their voices low. We placed the scuffed leather portfolio under it in a shadow box. The brass key, its tooth marked by years in a drawer, lay beside it on a linen pad. When I stood in front of them, sometimes I heard the tape hiss in the back of my mind, the sound of somebody loving you with instructions. 3 months later, after the first apprentices had their tools and 2 triple-deckers in Chelsea had drywall up, I drove out to Forest Hills Cemetery with a coffee and the letter folded in my pocket. I found my father's marker under a maple that leaned like it was trying to hear. I sat on the cold stone bench and read his words again. The wind lifted and lay down like breath. Some of it hurt, I told him. Some of it made it better. I placed the marble paperweight on his stone. Under my hand, it was still cool, still heavier than it looked. As I stood to go, I looked back once more at the dates, 1951 to 2005, and thought about how much gets buried between 2 numbers and how much can stay unburied if you do the paperwork right. When I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A photo from the foreman at Fields Corner of 3 apprentices standing under a light they had wired themselves faces lit from below like kids around a campfire. On my way home, I stopped at Bruno's even though it wasn't my shift. Bruno came out wiping his hands on a towel. "You back?" he said, eyebrows up. "In another way," I said. I bought a slice and sat on a bar stool whose vinyl had split and been taped back with silver. The red bag hung on a hook, empty. It looked lighter than I remembered. When I got back to my apartment, I opened the window even though it was still cold. The city sounded like itself. I rested the leather portfolio on the table. The scratch on my watch's 3 still caught the light. I touched the frame around the letter and felt, in my chest, the steady weight of the ground the way a building does when nobody is looking. Love had been the thing my father chose that didn't show up in any ledger, the only currency that didn't inflate when men spoke about it too loudly. In the quiet of my kitchen, with the marble weight cool under my fingertips, I understood that the truth he left wasn't to make me larger, but to make me strong enough to stay small when small was the right size.